A United Nations expert on torture has said that Julian Assange is being subjected to cruel and degrading treatment, and that several democratic states, that's a quote, are trying to break the whistleblower's will. The comments come after the Special Rapporteur visited the WikiLeaks founder in London's Belmarsh prison, where he's currently incarcerated and reportedly extremely unwell. RT's Going Underground spoke to Nils Melzer. The full interview airs on Saturday.
Julian Assange had physical consequences, clearly, from not being able to access dental and medical care for several years. The much more serious aspect is how he has been mentally and emotionally affected by the extremely hostile and increasingly arbitrary environment he has been exposed to for several years. So here he really showed all the symptoms that are typical for a person that has been exposed to prolonged psychological torture.
Well, with the UN official there coming into criticism for those comments, RT's Daniel Hawkins told me how deep the controversy could run.
The report and the remarks by the UN special expert on torture has grabbed the media's attention, but they've also drawn quite a stir online from officials. The UK Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt, for one, trading tweets with the United Nations Special Rapporteur about the extent of his involvement in the legal battles surrounding Julian Assange.
This is wrong. Assange chose to hide in the embassy and was always free to leave and face justice. The UN Special Rapporteur should allow British courts to make their judgments without his interference or inflammatory accusations.
With all due respect, sir, Mr. Assange was about as free to live as someone sitting on a rubber boat in a shark pool. As detailed in my formal letter to you, so far UK courts have not shown the impartiality and objectivity required by the rule of law.
Now, this Twitter spat is quite symbolic of the controversy Mr. Assange's case has drawn from all sides, between authorities, human rights organisations and the media community. This all stemmed, of course, from a report released by Mr. Melzer to the British authorities as well as other countries documenting the treatment of Assange. It's already got response not only from the UK Foreign Secretary but also from Australian authorities, who've issued a statement just earlier today strongly denying, rejecting any claims they've been complicit in any form of psychological torture, saying they have provided Mr. Assange with all the assistance he requires. Mr. Melzer, though, has insisted that these claims are not just speculation. He visited Assange in Belmarsh High Security Prison, where he's now being held alongside medical experts, spent several hours evaluating him. And his concerns, it has to be said, didn't pull any punches. He's described the treatment of Assange as a psychological torture, describing deliberate, concerted and sustained abuse, judicial persecution and arbitrary confinement, referring, of course, to his time in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. He made those comments to RT's Going Underground host Afshin Rattanzi. You can see the full interview, as you mentioned there, tomorrow. Here is a quick preview of what the UN official said to us earlier.
I have worked with prisoners, political prisoners and prisoners of war for 20 years. But what we do in these cases, we come with doctors and psychiatrists that apply a scientific protocol which is designed to examine potential victims of torture and ill treatment. And so we applied these standards, and the evidence was overwhelmingly clear that Julian Assange had been exposed to several forms of cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, which cumulatively can only be described as psychological torture. What has really shocked me with this particular case is that a single individual has been isolated and singled out by several democratic states and persecuted systematically and in a sustained manner to the point of breaking him.
This comes shortly after Julian Assange's extradition case in the UK court was postponed due to ill health, his lawyers stating he's unable to even hold a functional conversation. The Swedish authorities, on their part, have refused to postpone a hearing ruling on his detention in his absentia, despite calls from lawyers and human rights organisations. So it's clear he faces mounting legal pressure here from all sides. Mr. Melzer also expressed concerns about the potential for his extradition to the United States, where he, of course, faces 17 new charges from US prosecutors relating to the more serious allegation of espionage as opposed to simply computer hacking. These allegations would draw a much lengthier prison sentence. We're talking many decades, perhaps even life behind bars. So really there is no end in sight for the case of Julian Assange. And as this has dragged on, it's certainly drawn emotions and controversy from all sides, ranging from authorities, legal experts and human rights organisations to, of course, the wider journalist community.
Well, we can right now go live to Naomi Colvin, who's a whistleblower advocate and long-time supporter of Julian Assange. Naomi, good to have you on the programme. When did you last see Mr. Assange? Are you able to comment on his mental state?
I've seen some of the communications that he's written from prison. He's written to a few people, and he notes in the letters that he's been writing that he's feeling unwell. He knows that he's not as strong as he used to be. He's feeling a bit fragile. He is still trying to actively be involved in his case, and he's recognisably Julian in the letters that I've seen, but he is fragile. And I think last Friday in particular, that will have been the day when he received news about this extraordinary new indictment from the United States, when he's been charged with 17 counts under the Espionage Act, charges which are, unprecedented in their scope and in their breadth and in their severity. And I can imagine that coming on top of everything that he's suffered over the past few years, I can see how that would have had a very bad effect on him.
From what you're laying out there, how much do you put that down to his treatment in prison? What do you know concerning that?
Well, I don't think he's being treated differently from anybody else on his security level at Belmarsh. His security level is ridiculous for somebody who has been convicted of a quite minor and totally non-violent offence. But to put that one aside for the moment, I think that he experienced an awful lot of harm in the Ecuadorian embassy. I went to see him quite a lot during that period. I saw him decline a bit during that period, and I think during the last year when he sort of knew that the ceiling was about to fall in, and he was dealing with a very hostile environment, and he knew that he was being continually surveilled. I think that had an enormously poor effect on him, and I think that he deteriorated significantly during that period. I really do.
The United Nations is concerned. They have said Julian Assange has been subjected to psychological torture and accused several countries. Some of the early reaction to this, Naomi, they're questioning whether he has really been subjected to this, saying that it's a build-up of pressure and stress with the possible extradition hanging over him for half a decade instead. What say you to that?
Well, so I think there's two aspects to this. The first is that Julian has been living under unrelenting pressure for about a decade. That's not healthy for anyone. But on top of that, again, I refer you to this final period at the Ecuadorian embassy where he was continually surveilled. He was dealing with a very hostile environment. They changed all the staffs who would be horrible to him. He went weekends without having any food. His visitation was very restricted, and he knew that the deal had been done and the ceiling was about to fall in on him. I think that is psychological torture, and you can't just blame that on Ecuador, because as we know, the discussions to bring his stay in the embassy at the end happened between Ecuador, the UK and the US that we know of, and it's not as if Sweden were ignorant of what was going on because it was happening in public. So all of these states do bear some responsibility for what happened to him.
Okay, so you see a lot of external pressure. Do you think Mr. Assange should have used WikiLeaks, or perhaps one of his many balcony speeches, to perhaps more highlight his health concerns, to get it out there more publicly? Because for the first time, this is the first time a lot of people are hearing about this in the last month or two.
Sure. Well, I mean, I would say that, Julian, even when he was in the embassy, he had good days and bad days, and the ratio was always, he had some pretty good days, and he likes to put on a performance. And when people went to see him, I think that he often, would put on a pretty brave face about things. I think he did talk a bit about sort of the physical problems that he experienced while in the embassy, and he was unable to receive medical treatment. But he's quite a proud guy and quite a headstrong guy. He's not going to talk about his mental or emotional difficulties until it really comes to crisis point. He's kind of that kind of guy, basically.
OK, listen, thanks so much for coming on the programme and sharing your insight on this. Naomi Colvin, whistleblower advocate, speaking on the health and status of Julian Assange.